It is a traditional pattern that new discoveries first pass through certain cycles of immediate reaction and then gradually settle down to more careful and orderly thoughtfulness. This has been true of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the beginning, these scrolls were largely in the keeping of specialists in languages and related biblical matters. The first accounts were published, therefore, very largely under the influence of biblical archaeology. Now that the university in Israel has made possible a broader distribution of these texts through facsimiles of the original documents in the original languages, it has been possible for persons of various minds to begin to examine them and to attempt to refine, direct, and interpret their content. Of course, this impact also produces a cycle of usual expectancies. Nearly every type of thinker has attempted to add something to the interpretation of these scrolls. And if the reports are true, some not too thoughtful have also attempted to make contributions. It is a difficult field, and perhaps has pointed up more than any discovery in the last 1,000 years our comparative lack of knowledge of the conditions prevailing in the Near East at approximately the beginning of the Christian era. This era has been completely blanketed by biblical thinking, and we have assumed that the New Testament practically covers all available information relating to the first century of Christianity. These different limitations, probably intensified by the lack of adequate historical records, has come to mean a great deal to the interpreters of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They do not have available the background of general knowledge necessary to handle this situation with surety and penetration. I observed at the beginning of this rather involved controversy that the discovery of these scrolls in an area close to the site of the old Essenes brotherhood near the Dead Sea should not be allowed to dominate the interpretation of the document. The coincidence or accidental discovery in this region does not constitute certain and inevitable proof that these documents express the conviction or were intimately related with the Essene order. For some time, there seemed to be no inclination on the part of interpreters to shift from their original position. But in the last year, several good scholars of insight, not only in language but in religious philosophy, have also begun to doubt that these documents represent the philosophy, the mysticism, or the concept of the Essene group. There is nothing particular in the discovery to force Essenianism upon this find. It is quite possible that these religious mystics, following in a practice almost universally observed, did have some manuscripts and books. These manuscripts and books, however, would not again be actual evidence that such manuscripts or such books necessarily reflected their own opinions or beliefs. If 2,000 years from now we should excavate the site of some large American university or public institution, we might well find books and manuscripts from all over the world. But such find would not indicate that these books and manuscripts dominated our culture or necessarily met with the common agreement of our people. The discovery of a Chinese manuscript in the United States would not necessarily mean that a Chinese culture existed here at some remote time. It would be quite possible that enthusiastic collectors, national institutions, or even individuals might bring such manuscripts or cause them to be placed in a certain location where they would not normally be expected. In the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is very reasonable that a considerable literature did exist, although we have not found a great deal. That this literature might have been in a library or in a collection or have been the private property of an organization does not mean that this same literature would be their textbook or that they would agree with it in every detail or that it would necessarily express their own convictions. The fact that these scrolls were officially buried according to the practice of the time might also have a bearing upon this particular point. It was customary among ancient people, rather contrary to our way of life, to regard books with a certain veneration. This is notable in China, where it was considered a very serious offense to throw a book away or to drop it in some ash can or something of that nature. Books were regarded with a curious kind of admiration, and if they were no longer necessary or useful, they were given decent burial. They were protected against mutilation or desecration, either by being burned, which was a common practice, or by being buried in some convenient location. The book, in other words, should not be used for purposes contrary to its original intention. It was therefore quite common to take an old book, one which had reached such a degree of decrepitude that it was no longer practical or no longer useful to handle it. It was just beyond repair or restoration, and place it in some vault or some place of permanent care where it would be buried, no longer available, no longer useful, but protected against vandalism. It was also quite common that books or works which a group did not acknowledge or did not admire would be taken away and similarly buried. Also in the process of revising text, if a work was regarded or came to be regarded as an inaccurate or incomplete exposition of a subject, and a better and more complete version was created or found, the book which might be misleading or might misinterpret something was also taken away and given decent burial. Now the idea that a library such as the one at the Dead Sea may have been placed in such concealment to protect it from enemies or to preserve records is also conceivable. On the other hand, the records or the permanent values which would thus be so carefully protected have not been discovered in the manuscripts in question. There is nothing in these manuscripts from the standpoint of long perspective which would cause us to assume that the original owner was preserving them for posterity. Whatever they contain would be more or less current in his time, and probably sufficiently well known not to receive such very particular consideration. If these manuscripts had contained records otherwise not available in the time, you might assume that they were placed there for storage purposes. It seems more likely, under existing conditions, that these manuscripts were either regarded as worn out at that time, no longer practical to handle or use, or else that for some reason they had been given honorable burial because the community in case no longer required them. This type of thinking has gradually begun to crystallize among scholars, and the more these manuscripts have been studied, the more certain this crystallization seems to be. Among the most important finds, of course, is the early manuscript of Isaiah. This manuscript, which gives us one of the first discovered fragments of the Old Testament in reasonably complete form, is certainly to us a very valuable find. It is important because of the fact that it takes back the popular tradition and the popular version of the Old Testament to a greater antiquity that had previously been available. We know that we had, up to that time, with the exception of a very few, very scattered fragments, no evidence of the original form of the Old Testament books in the original language earlier than about the 11th or 12th century A.D. We know also that the modern Jewish Bible has been translated from the Greek, and therefore that original manuscripts in the native languages are a curiosity. Also, perhaps the reading of the manuscript has given us a certain ability to re-estimate the probable accuracies of Old Testament records. We find, for example, that with the exception of a very few somewhat controversial terms, the older manuscript does not differ in any essential from the version which we find in the Septuagint. Under the dating concept, it is therefore quite possible that this manuscript was either contemporary with or was prepared shortly after the editing of the Septuagint in North Africa. This Septuagint version was in Greek and became what we know as the Bible or Old Testament of Christianity, for it is the Old Testament quoted in the New Testament by both Jesus and his apostles. The discovery of the book of Isaiah helps us because it gives us some reason to assume that in all probability the Old Testament as we have it today is not in any major manner different from the way it was at the beginning of the Christian era. This has a considerable interest for Bible students all over the world. When we come to the other manuscripts, we observe definitely the total lack of internal dating or any sure and certain method by which we can discover the particular group or the particular circumstances with which they are associated. The tendency has been to assume that the entire collection was created or brought together, or these particular copies were made sometime between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD. Very careful examination under laboratory tests has removed any reasonable possibility that they could be forgeries, fabrications, or late copies. There is every reason now to assume that they have an antiquity of approximately 2,000 years. This antiquity would therefore place them back at a rather crucial point in Jewish history. Unfortunately, they are so close to this point that present research is unable to state with clarity exactly which side of the mysterious line of the Christian era we are to place them. They might be immediately before or very shortly after. From the internal content, there is no indication that the authors of these manuscripts were aware of Christianity as we know it. Thus, the possibility that they were perhaps 100 years prior to the Christian era, perhaps not quite so great a time. The manuscripts do, however, present to us a fair picture of the confusion existing in the minds of the people at that time. They show us a people in bondage. They show us a people under great psychic stress. They point out to us the natural mechanisms which all peoples of all time have exhibited under these circumstances. They show us definitely the rise of schismatic groups. They show us definitely the gradual focusing of religious opinion upon the great political issue of the time. In these details, they are valuable, but they are also not completely dated, as this emergency extended throughout the period under controversy. The reason why several writers have gradually come to the same conclusion, namely that it is unlikely that these manuscripts were actually texts of Essenian thought, will be found in the general atmosphere of the manuscripts themselves. Surely we do not have an elaborate record of the Essene group. We know only the witness stories of Josephus and Pliny and some of those who came very close to the occasion. We find, however, that the Essene thinking also was strongly supported by Philo-Judaeus, who seems to have had a close and intimate, at least intellectual association with this group. Josephus, speaking for not only his own people, but for the general attitude of the Romans of the time, gives us a picture of the Essenes that would certainly not be consistent with certain finds in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. Much is made of the contrition, the piety, the gentleness, the charity, the profound humility of this group. These qualities are not dominant in the text of the scroll. Also, it is very probable that had these scrolls, certain of them particularly, have been available to the Romans, or their content had been known to the Romans, the extraordinary attitude of tolerance of the Roman governors to the Essenes would not have existed. These manuscripts present in many ways a highly controversial and rather bitter denunciation of circumstances, and do not have the patience, the gentle aloofness of a truly mystical perception. Now, we may assume, of course, that in the course of time, an organization has gained a reputation contrary, perhaps even to its deserts. We look deeply into the lives of people. We do not always find them as admirable as first impression may convey or public opinion may endorse. On the other hand, this group was small, never reaching any major proportion. It was a completely ascetic group, and it lived and flourished surrounded by members of contrary groups. There was no real unity of religious thinking at that time in the area. There were a tremendous number of splinter groups breaking off from Orthodox Judaism, and these groups were many of them extremely bitter and carried the heavy psychological burden of the time. This burden being particularly foreign dictatorship, the Roman dominion of an ancient free people, and the sense of slavery and oppression, which had psychologically demoralized these people. Thus, it is unlikely that the Essene community would have been so completely misrepresented by a contemporary historian. He must have had, Josephus must have had, some general knowledge. He could not have written of a contemporary group entirely away from the truth, without some record or some inconsistency appearing down through the centuries that followed. Also, it is important to remember the dating of this organization, the Essene group. This group went out of existence, vanished away, and disappeared from history shortly after the beginning of the Christian era. There is no record of what happened to it, and a great many historians and thinkers have attempted to restore the picture in some way. That these people were mystics, Philo further supports. That they had deep and beautiful understanding, Philo reveals to us. And we have every reason to believe that his own highly mystical interpretation of Jewish religion was influenced by the Essene concepts. These concepts, these interpretations, this mysticism, such factors do not receive any general support from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They do not approach the subject with any of the comparative thought which we associate with this group. All of the writers on the Essenes, particularly those of the contemporary body, have pointed out the dependence of this organization upon Greek philosophy. There is a deep legend, rather at least supported by public opinion, if not by all documentary evidence, that the organization may have been founded by Pythagoras or his disciples. That it was deeply concerned with ideals and tenets that were not in substance and entirety orthodox Jewish doctrines. These people believed in a type of religious conviction that was more or less Platonic or Pythagorean. And while they did subscribe very wholeheartedly to the laws of their country, and they lived as far as possible at peace with their neighbors, and were respected for conduct primarily, they certainly did have a perspective on religion, philosophy, and personal living somewhat deeper and broader than that prevailing at their time. This perspective is not to be traced in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This brings us then to this curious point, namely the disappearance of this order. There have been several possible answers to it. One has been that organizations of this kind have a tendency to fade out with changing times. That when a certain pressure has been released, or when uncertainty has passed even into its most negative crises, or has passed into a negative certainty, the transition movement become no longer valid. That people either finding new courage or reaching a point of total discouragement are no longer concerned with the mechanism of hope with which these organizations were largely motivated. There is also the school of belief that the rise of Christian mysticism in the Near East resulted in the absorbing of the Essene sect into the early Christian religious life. There have been many points to indicate the validity of this particular position, namely that the Essenes were the pre-Christian Christian mystics, and that when Christianity was finally established, they verged into union with it because of the natural parallels and because perhaps the Essenes regarded Christianity as the fulfillment of the mission which they had sought to establish. In any event, they disappear. Now, in the case of disappearance, we might have some wonder as to what happened to their various chattels. We know that their religious buildings, their communities, passed into ruin. They did not apparently go into other hands. They were either deserted or simply allowed to fade away, leaving only an occasional broken foundation to show where they had stood. Under these conditions also, the treasures or possessions of this order might naturally change hands. If they had no longer the need or desire for such books and manuscripts as we have mentioned, it is quite possible that they were buried with other effects, or that they were regarded as no longer valid, or that the community, fading away for other reasons, had no longer any way to care for them. Therefore, they were put away against perhaps the passing of time, or in the thought that someday, somewhere, they might be valuable. In any event, the burial or the removal from some public collection of such manuscripts could well be part of the vanishing away of a group. Incidentally, the period from the 1st to the 3rd centuries was a period marked with a great deal of vanishing away of old groups. The world was changing very rapidly at that time. The great shift which we have since observed was beginning to be felt throughout the world. Actually, I think we should say that the first 3 centuries of the Christian era represented the beginning of our period of economic expansion. We like to think that perhaps the modern world came into existence in the 19th or 20th century. Actually, it came into existence more completely in the 1st and 2nd centuries. It came into existence because the world passed gradually, the known world of the day, passed gradually under the control of a highly realistic culture, that of Rome. The Roman was our legitimate economic ancestor. He had the same essential motives of expansion, creation of empire, intertrade between peoples. He had the same essential interest in broadening the world that we have experienced more recently. True, his broadening did not go entirely beyond the Mediterranean area, although he did include a large part of Europe and Asia Minor, North Africa. But he created the first international, interracial empire. And he also created a kind of commonwealth of states, by means of which, for the first time, peoples were permitted to continue their own cultures under the broad dominion of a Roman policy. The result was, in most instances, the establishment of better interracial, international understanding. It was a bitter pill, of course, for those who had previously lived aloof and alone, locked within homogeneous cultures. Yet it did broaden the horizon of the world, and it did move men very strongly from the old foundations of isolated thinking and living into a new pattern of commonwealth association. There were also important economic changes at about this time. One of these changes being the increasing pressure upon the individual to create his own method of financial survival. Prior to that time, it had been an almost unwritten law that the individual who wished to devote himself to abstract thinking did not need to become involved in economics. He was able to retire into some remote place, live simply, maintain himself, and perhaps follow the old way of dedication to learning and a certain minor support from the state. With the rise of Rome, this became a rather difficult situation. We find in the old records, for example, something that is burdening us today. Rome brought with it a strong inflation of money on the level of economics. Most individuals found that they had to have more money than they had had before in order to survive. And in order to do this, it was necessary for them to engage more completely in various trades, crafts, and professions. This time also there was a strong division between the temple and the sciences. Up to that time, nearly all of the essentials of life were under the dominion of religion. And as religion, state-supported, these essentials were available without financial responsibility. In the days, for example, prior to the rise of the Roman Empire, medicine was part of religion. It was considered the right of the citizen to go to the temple, and priests dedicated to medical studies and researches worked with him, found remedies for his ailments if possible, and gave him the advantage of their knowledge without cost. These things were subsidized almost completely under the broad heading of religion. With the rise of Rome came the secular physician, who charged for his services, the secular lawyer, who charged for his services, the secular artist, who sold his pictures rather than presenting them to the temple, the secular craftsman, who received wages for building rather than donating his services to the temple. With this came a strong need for the rise of independent economic life. And where such a change as this, which in our perspective would not be very meaningful, but from those days and in that time, this rapid change was extremely meaningful and undoubtedly brought to an end a considerable amount of the preceding leisure with which various religious and philosophical institutions were concerned, and which made their existence possible. Also, at that time, through the contact of the Roman Empire, a subject previously almost unknown, with the exception of the brief interlude of Akhenaton in Egypt, was brought to general public attention. And we may say that it was in this period, between the 1st and 3rd centuries A.D., that the philosophy or the science of comparative religion came into existence as the result of Rome. At that time, the Roman, for the first occasion, and man, generally speaking, for the first time, became popularly aware that persons of other beliefs could do business with him. And I think we must admit that comparative religion was largely sustained and made possible by world trade. The merchant coming along the caravan route from some distant area, bringing fine silk, spices, and other valuables, came into the marketplace of a people with different gods and different religions. But regardless of your God, regardless of your religion, you were important if you had good tea. And tea was important. Silk was important. Rare chemicals, drugs, and dyes were important. And these came along the caravan route. Later, paper came along this same route, and this was important. Out of all these considerations, men of different faiths met in the marketplaces and bartered their goods. Previously, religion had been a very great dividing factor, except for a very small intellectual group. Now this religious tolerance extended throughout the Roman Empire. And in the Forum in Rome, facing the great square there, were temples to a dozen or more religions. And the peoples of these temples were given assurance that they had the protection of Rome, except in two matters. They were good citizens, welcome, and could teach as they pleased, provided that two things. First, that they paid their taxes, and second, that they kept out of politics. With these two revisions or restrictions, they might do as they pleased. Now, it would be inevitable that such policies would affect the broad life of the people. The people became more and more aware of a vast commonwealth of belief, and it became increasingly difficult for them to maintain certain isolation of thinking that had previously marked their relationships with each other. Now, apparently, our Dead Sea Scrolls came into existence in the midst of this great cycle of changes. Came into existence, perhaps, in a rather reactionary group. A group that was fighting change. A group that was fighting this different perspective. Such a group would not have been in the spirit of the Essene organization at all. For we have every notice from the early writers that this organization required only two virtues, primarily, as essential to membership in the society. The first was a simple and natural love of God, and the second was a natural inclination to work. These two things were required. And as they themselves said, the true water of baptism is the sweat of honest toil. These people were a simple working community of pietists, apparently making every possible effort to steer a safe course through the political dissensions of their time. This carefulness, this thoughtfulness, this reservation, this worldly detachment, these qualities are not evident in the text that we have. So we could look around us for a moment to see where such texts might well have originated. Assuming, for example, that they found their way into a depository around the region of the Essene community, and realizing also that the date of the writing of the manuscripts, or the dating of them, does not necessarily indicate exactly the date in which they were buried. It is quite possible that these manuscripts were buried either from any period of time, either 100 or 200 years after they were written. The manuscripts show considerable sign of native wear before they were placed in these containers. Consequently, they may have been well used. And there is nothing to tell us with certainty that these manuscripts were actually buried prior to the dissolution of the Essene order. They may have been placed there after the organization itself had perished, because we have no record of it later than the 1st century AD. If such is the case, the burial may have even been coincidental. But assuming that it was in some way affected by the community or brought about by them, we should say that these manuscripts could represent not one group, but several. That each could have originated in an entirely different religious atmosphere. It is quite possible that the manuscript of Isaiah could represent, and probably did represent, a cherished fragment of Orthodox Judaism at that time. It is also possible that these other manuscripts represented the beliefs of sects or teachers flourishing at that period. Bearing this in mind, let us get a little perspective on what was flourishing and how we should begin to interpret the surrounding religious opinion. Realize, of course, that the Judaistic work, which had gradually been integrated into what we call the Old Testament collection, probably about the time of the Maccabees, was now a solid corpus or body, consisting of approximately the Old Testament as we know it today. Also realize that these various books brought together were actually a kind of accumulation built around the great and significant central unit, which was the indispensable structure of the sacred writing, namely the Torah, the law, the Pentateuch, that is, the 5 books of Moses. All of the other books must be regarded as amplifications, expansions, and interpretations of these 5 books. Thus we had a strong structure of Jewish literature. Part of it incorporated from the religious structure of the people, from the formal religion, and partly collected from the popular veneration of the people. Works such as the Scroll of Esther, and the Scroll of Ruth, the Book of Job, and the Song of Solomon, these works were incorporated into the Scriptures because of the popular approval of the people. And according to the findings of the Great Sanhedrin, they were included because they had become traditionally valuable to the life of the people. There was no particular justification on the ground of spiritual predetermination. They were simply there because the people loved them, had always venerated them, read them on sacred occasions, and gradually they came to be incorporated into the canon itself. Thus we have a strong literature of popular approval, a literature which was built upon one essential concept, namely that the children of Israel had been set apart for a spiritual destiny, and that as long as they kept the laws which had been given to them by their God, this destiny flourished. When they broke these laws, they were punished, and their peoples were scattered. When they repented, the Lord forgave them, and again their nation flourished. When once more they failed, they were once more scattered. This was a long story of persecution, of repentance, of virtue, and of vice. It was the common story of people, a kind of story that we all know. And whenever an emergency arose within the structure of these people, there came with it a certain sense of guilt. It was assumed, as we have long assumed in religion, that when we suffer, it is because we have done something that is wrong. We have offended God. We have broken the laws and the rules. Now, fortunately for the sanctity of sacred books, man is nearly always able to justify his need for suffering. The average person examining into his life, and the collective examining into its tradition, both of these groups find that by their conduct they have failed, that they have not lived the principles which they claim, that they have not been true to the codes that have been given to them, that they have intentionally and frequently broken the commandments of heaven, and also that they have transgressed the rights of their fellow men. And because every human being living under a positive and strong code realizes that in some respects he has failed that code, it is not difficult for him to justify the need for punishment. He finds it perfectly reasonable to assume that he has sinned and that the universal law is just. It is much easier and more convenient for him to suspect himself of error than to try to pass judgment upon the gods. Thus, in this period particularly, and in other periods of history likewise, the people of the Near East, realizing that they had come under the bondage of foreign powers, that their freedom, that their rights had been taken from them, that they had been humiliated, that their ancient rulers were no longer governing them, that with these unhappy, miserable circumstances, that they were being punished for things that they themselves had done. Under these conditions, the need for repentance was very strong, and organizations like the Essene order apparently were created out of this general need for virtue, the attempt to prove to God that men were good, that they would keep the law, and that there was never a real forgetfulness about such matters. If, however, this was the more common approach, there were other approaches also. Some individuals were convinced that perhaps the troubles and tribulations that were descending upon them had something to do with their beliefs or with their religion. Many individuals find, for example, that their religion comes into conflict with the time in which they live. They find that the very practice of their faith may involve them in difficulties. That if they are too generous and too honest, that they may be exploited and injured. This brings another important crisis into the religious life of man. The problem as to whether or not he can accept literally the various doctrines that have been given to him. Perhaps he did not fail intentionally, perhaps he misunderstood. And in an effort to try to clarify the desire of God for a particular circumstance or a particular course of action, the learned and the wise gather together to try to work out the intricate bridging between such a simple document as the Ten Commandments and the actual daily life of the people. The difficulty in attempting to apply the will of God on subjects in which the Bible is silent, therefore in which there was no authority available from Scripture. And of course, out of this struggle, out of this vast structure of interpreting, came the great structures of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmud. These were the great findings of the elders concerning the will of God through the profound study of the Scriptures and through the interpretation and extension of every concept contained therein to the ultimate formation of a code of jurisprudence for the administration of the state. Now we know that this code gradually accumulated under diverse and mysterious conditions. There is much to indicate that all the elders were not wise. There is also much to show that they were heavily influenced by prevailing habits, customs, and practices, and therefore that they could not arrive at ultimate conclusions on these subjects. The moment, however, the individual or the group entered into interpretation or extension of idea from original text, this same group entered into chaos, because most of these texts were susceptible of innumerable interpretation. And sects grew upon interpretation and finally declared war with each other upon the cause of interpretation. In a short time, therefore, perhaps within a century, after the rise of this interpretive effort to explain the fall of the independent kingdom of Judea, almost immediately, men began to interpret. They tried to work out explanations or reasons for the various things that occurred. They tried also desperately to find solutions by again using the text that they had accepted as inspired. There arose among these people, as in every other nation, therefore, certain groups, not only those working with internal matters, but those reaching out into other available systems, looking for the answers they could not find in their own. Thus we find among these people a growing interest in Greek philosophy, an effort to bring Socrates and Plato and Aristotle to the aid of Moses in trying to work out practical solutions to the critical differences and distress of the people. We find these scholars also moving into the further eastern areas and into North Africa, seeking more knowledge. And with the increase of common contact between peoples, these scholars observed that in some matters other nations had excelled them, that other nations could be better governed, that other civilizations were not in the disaster they were in. Why? And how could they find from the words and teachings and laws of other people solutions to their own problems? Locked as they were within a distress, and finding no available remedy within that distress, they broke into two distinct groups. One group composed of those willing to seek anywhere for more light, more knowledge, and with a general dissatisfaction for the policies and interpretations which had apparently failed, and the second group composed of those who under this stress and strain broadly assumed that it was a testing, that it was God's will that these people should find purification through suffering, and therefore only by total acceptance, total humility, and total regeneration could the solution be found. These became the ones to renounce the world and worldliness, and to seek the direct piety of personal conduct with which the Essene order was peculiarly distinguished. Now those that followed the other course, searching everywhere to build up a kind of international, intercultural policy or plan for conduct, also broke into innumerable smaller groups, with the result that probably from 50 to 100 sects were flourishing in the Holy Land at the period, the general period associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of these sects were extremely abstract, distant, detached from our ways of thinking. Others were strangely belligerent, aggressive, revengeful. Nearly all claimed the common cause for their concern, namely the misery of their people. Some were in favor of trying to solve the problem peacefully. Others were in favor of forthright war. All of these groups, however, were still under the broad blanket of religious opinion. Consequently, in each case, they justified their numerous attitudes by recourse to a common body of literature, essentially what we call the Old Testament. But they brought to bear upon this literature a great many foreign ideas. Among these types we will find the Gebbers of Hebron, the Syrian Gnosis, the Nazarene sect, and those that practiced innumerable particular doctrines. These sects also were to a measure intensified by locale. Such sects as bordered upon other peoples, where intercourse with other nations, races, or cultures were most convenient. Such people began to draw into themselves the teachings of these other groups. Thus we find the introduction of Babylonian and Egyptian opinion and doctrine. On the other hand, such sects as arose in the very heart of Judaism itself were inclined to be more orthodox and to conform most closely with Jewish opinion. Looking over this entire group, then, in an effort to trace some of these writings to their most probable cause or source, and realizing also that it was in the first century that Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai were involved in the development of the Kabbalah, a new and mystical school dedicated almost completely to a transcendental art, the art of religion as magic, the art of religion as a mysterious power by which the individual could gain complete insight into the spiritual will of God. But all of these factors should be weighed in attempting to discover the origin of these scrolls. Perhaps the nearest text we have today to certain fragments in the Dead Sea finds, the nearest text that we have is the Codex Nazareus, or the Book of Adam. This was the ancient text of the Nazarene sect. Now, Jesus was suspected of being a Nazar. Certainly he was a man out of Nazareth. He is said to have been recognized as a Nazar because of the garment he wore and because he did not cut his hair or beard, which was part of the obligation of this sect. That there can be no doubt that the Nazarenes did have a rather highly involved and complicated doctrine. And here again is something that is a little difficult for us to understand today in the light of a totally different perspective. Usually today, when a sacred book or a religious writing gains prominence, it is because it is backed by a powerful organization or because it is accepted by a very large group of our people. Thus a sect may arise in our modern world, and before it gains authority, it must have 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, or 10 million followers. Then it becomes socially significant. In those days, some of the most brilliant names that we have, outstanding names in leadership of world thought, consisted of groups of 100, 200, 300 people. They have been preserved in history ever since, but they were never large groups. We know that the Essenes community was a very small group. It is very questionable if during his lifetime Plato reached 200 people. And yet the effect of his work gained a tremendous prominence. On these grounds, therefore, when we speak of the Nazarene sect, we are not speaking of something of vast numerical strength. We are speaking of a very strong, small group, functioning mostly in secret, and leaving behind them one sacred book, which has, however, survived, although comparatively unknown, and so far as we know, no printed edition is available in English. Yet this book, in many respects, gives us a key and clue to some of the Dead Sea material. It contains several factors which parallel and some which diverge. The most important factors which diverge, for example, would be the development of the Nazarene sect concerning the entire interpretation of the Pentateuch. This sect had its own account of the creation of man, the creation of the universe, the fall of humanity, and the regeneration of man. It did not even use the orthodox Jewish terms, but derived mysterious names, probably from ancient worship in the area, long before its integration into Judaism as we know it. It also probably was influenced by the early Syrian Gnosis and other sects that came in, perhaps even from Persia or even from far India. In any event, however, the Nazarene group built a very powerful work, much of which is dynamic and constructive, and a general survey of this work can be found in the work called Sod by Dunlap, which can be consulted in our library. The original work was translated from the Syriac into Latin by Norbert, and that can also be consulted in our collection. But unfortunately, the only translations that I know in English are the ones that were made for me. In this case, however, we come upon a very prominent point. We remember that in the Dead Sea Scrolls there is a work almost dominated by maledictions, by most awful cursings, by most terrible threats, and by a complete spirit of intolerance. Looking around among the groups of the time, we come upon the Codex Nazareus. Here we find page after page devoted to identical maledictions. We find the terrible penalties and the horrible punishments to be inflicted upon those who break the laws and the rules of the sect, and the terrible tribulation that will come to anyone who differs from the findings of this particular group. Undoubtedly, from the tone of the work, the group itself had been under heavy persecution and general rejection. It had created the defense of turning upon those that had attacked it. And it had survived very largely by binding its own membership and its own group into so tight a confraternity that nothing could break through it. It was at war with those that had persecuted it, those that had declared it to be heretical. So that this sect certainly was heretical. and might possibly well justify the fact that when used in the Scripture in relation to Jesus, the fact that he was held as a man of Nazareth caused him to be held in disrepute. It was possible that this area was the center of a powerful schismatic group that was of great concern to the Orthodox Jews of the time. In any event, we find kinship. We find a strong friendship between these two collections of writings. We find the same tone, the same purpose, the same underlying motive. And it was much more likely that these highly controversial manuscripts found in the Dead Sea collection will relate to these other sects, such as the ones we have mentioned, rather than to the peace-loving, charitable, and pious Essene community. Also among these manuscripts has come to light one point of great interest to us, and that is the effort to identify the nature, person, or function of the teacher of righteousness. This teacher of righteousness has struck the popular fancy of modern man in connection with these scrolls, and several efforts have been made to try to clearly indicate what could be symbolically understood in the manuscripts themselves. One scholar who is reading them in the original and has a profound psychological insight into the period of the time is quite convinced that among these manuscripts are definite cryptical works which are intended to be read in two ways. Works containing what we might almost call today ciphers, but probably not so much Kabbalistic ciphers in the sense of the value of words and letters numerically and so on, but symbolic ciphers. Ciphers in which certain particulars or certain incidents, as for example the distributions of the armies of the Lord, might have other meaning than that which is immediately available. It has been suggested that this manuscript dealing so-called with the War of the Sons of Light is actually an outline or description of a network of secret societies existing at that time in the area, or perhaps binding it with other regions. That much of this material was therefore carefully written so that if it fell into the hands of the wrong people, it would not cause further persecution or open these individuals to destruction for their allegiances. The problem of the teacher of righteousness, therefore, comes under this general heading. Is it intended that this teacher shall represent the Jewish Messiah? This has been the first thought, because of the fact it was assumed, and with some probability, that the manuscript was pre-Christian. Did it represent the fulfillment of the burden of the Jewish prophets? We know that the burden of the Jewish prophets was essentially that of the restoration of Israel. The Messiah of Israel was to come from the royal house of David. He was not only to be the spiritual redeemer of the people, but he was also to be king over Israel. He was supposed to come to liberate the people, to fulfill them, and to rescue them, and restore them to favor with the Most High. If the concept of the teacher of righteousness could therefore be applied as the symbol of the restoration of the entire empire of Judea, that the people themselves, as the chosen people, out of their common body, formed the messianic body. This, in the light of the Jewish philosophy of the time, would have been a strong binding point. We also realize that under the uncertainties of the day, with Israel in bondage, with the people heartbroken and sick and weary of spirit, that the hope for the messianic advent would be strong. So that the possibility that this teacher of righteousness represented a prophet prophet through whom the fulfillment of the promise of Israel should be attained. This would be a perfectly natural, reasonable explanation of the entire situation. The second school of thought, assuming the possibility that these scrolls represent a bridging between the Orthodox Jewish communion and the rising promise of Christianity, have applied to the character of the teacher of righteousness the same general methodology that they have applied to the book of Isaiah and other works. In other words, have made every valiant effort to indicate or to justify that all of these promises were fulfilled in the advent of Jesus, and that he was the one that all these groups were waiting for. Now this, of course, brings the subject under a strong Christian scholarship, and naturally would not be acceptable or would not have been acceptable to Orthodox Jewry, even then or now. The possibility, therefore, that the Dead Sea Scroll prophecies and descriptions of the teacher of righteousness, that this possibility, that it might be an announcement of the coming of Jesus, has been weighed and thought about in an effort to see whether it could be considered a strong point in favor of rising Christianity. One point, however, that seems to still confound these scholars is the inability to link this factor with any known circumstance. In other words, the element remains in suspension. It does not go anywhere. It remains an isolated or broken fragment. Now the third group is just beginning to emerge out of this rather involved situation. And the third group is taking the ground that it is quite possible that these references and that the work containing them actually belongs to the 1st century A.D. and is not a Christian book, but relates to a certain teacher, historically identified, who did flourish at that time and who to a very large degree fulfills the requirements of the book. That he was one of those controversial personalities that emerged, left a mark upon history, and in due course departed. That therefore this work, by referring to him and by describing his ministry, dates itself to an historical personality of the 1st century. That this personality was not Jesus, but was one of the Jewish teachers. Now this gives us 3 possible answers to our situation. And now there is also gradually developing a 4th. And the 4th viewpoint is that the teacher of righteousness represents the head of a mystical order. That he is the equivalent of the Egyptian hierophant, or the high priest of an ancient Greek mystery school. That he represented a kind of grand master of secret orders, which were flourishing in Syria and the Lebanon beneath the surface of things. That he was the sort of inner ruler of the spiritual life of man, like the mysterious, unidentified leader of the dervish movement in Islam. That he was, therefore, a person, or perhaps more correct than that, even an office. That regardless of the shifting of personalities, that there was always a secret high priest in Israel. That the hierarchy of Israel was divided, very much as the hierarchy of Christendom was later divided, into the descent of the Orthodox faith, centered in the high priest of Jerusalem, and the descent of an apocryphal, mysterious, secret, mystical faith, which had existed for ages, and which had been founded upon the unwritten law of Moses, and that this particular group was under the leadership of a secret person, or a hierarchy led by a secret appointed person known as the teacher of righteousness. And that this teacher was the high priest of the mystical sects of his time. There is some support, for instance, in this, in the later experiences of the Crusaders, Well, when the Crusaders began to reach the Holy Land in the 12th and 13th centuries, they report that they met the secret head of Christianity, that the Christos of the mysteries still existed, and at that time was resident in Egypt, and that he claimed a direct descent from the original mystery sects behind Christianity. Now, if this mysterious being, who still carried the hierarchical name of the Christos, existed at that time and claimed an unbroken descent from a much earlier tradition, then there might be some ground for assuming that this teacher of righteousness represented the spiritual head of the various religions of the region, that he was a very sacred and mystical person, and that actually this person changed from time to time, but the office went on, and that this office was the office of those who worshiped the hidden God of Israel, the Archangel Michael. Such thinking is, of course, a little difficult for us today, and we cannot expect the biblical archaeologists to become overexcited about it. In the first place, these gentry do not assume that there is any mystical tradition. They do not assume there is anything in this problem that does not meet the eye. They would not wish to consider that these people had a belief that there were keys to their secret religion, and that they did possess and always did worship more than appeared upon the surface of things. Under these conditions, the teacher of righteousness could emerge as an integrating center, perhaps known to many, but perhaps not often referred to, and probably it was not intended that this reference should be known, perhaps leading to the burial of the record. Perhaps it's also possible that in the course of time it was hoped that the fact would be discovered. Again, of course, we have a parallel for this in the New Testament, where we have the description by John of the mysterious being bearing the stars and with a two-edged sword coming out of his mouth, standing in the midst of the seven candlesticks. This has been regarded as a pure vision, but we know that it was actually taken from the initiation rite at Phrygia, and that during the rite, the Hierophant of the Mysteries, with these symbols and with this regalia, and standing in the midst of the seven lamps, actually appeared to the candidate as the high priest of the sect. Therefore, this story definitely deals with a priestly ritual, and it is quite likely that the story of the teacher of righteousness has a foundation in priestly ritual and in the beliefs of these people. There is another school of thought that is gradually emerging likewise, dealing with the entire subject psychologically. Here we have, of course, some influence from our modern attitude, namely that the teacher of righteousness is an archetypal symbol, and that for that reason all hierophants, all masters of secret schools, all great philosophers, mystics, messiahs, and leaders have ultimately become associated together in the formation of the archetypal concept of the teacher. The teacher of righteousness, then, is the ever-coming truth. The teacher of righteousness may be considered on one level, therefore, the world itself, which through experience is bringing all men to wisdom. The teacher of righteousness may be intuition. It may also be the human soul. It may be the God in man, the Christ in you, the hope of glory. The teacher of righteousness is perhaps likewise to be associated with a certain dynamic wish fulfillment in the human personality. Namely, that all human beings, as Aristotle says, desire to know. And that out of the desire to know comes the conviction that knowledge is available. This conviction, in turn, must bridge the interval between ignorance and wisdom. And it does so by various machineries. Machineries of effort, of study, of growth, of communication. But gradually there arose also the machinery factor, that knowing was in some way related to certain persons who, having knowledge, had the right power and instinct to bestow it upon others. Thus the teacher of righteousness becomes the symbol of the eternal teacher, the knower sharing with those who do not know. A man searching knowledge seeks always his master, his guru, his teacher, someone whom he symbolically conceives to be knowing. And from the beginning of time, men have made pilgrimage to every part of the world, searching for those who know. And on the level of religion, this searching for those who know has been very closely related to the building up of religious systems and the creation of our common and universal respect for prophets, teachers, and leaders. It is therefore to be assumed that this is conceivable, that it could represent definitely the archetypal representation of knowledge. We have other archetypal representations of this kind in the Old Testament. And as this material was probably partly inspired by the ancient writings, we have no reason to doubt, for example, that to thousands and maybe more than thousands of very Orthodox Jewish people of the time, the elders of the great Sanhedrin, sitting together under the elder of elders, might regard him as the teacher of righteousness, because he would represent the fountainhead of the traditional knowledge of the people. Also, the desire and the conviction of the search for wisdom, in which each person hopes someday to be brought into the presence of that which knows, or that which can communicate, and may regard this presence as within himself. All these begin to take psychological form. And out of the psychological form, in turn, comes the mystical theological speculation that the teacher of righteousness represents the internal consciousness of man, that it represents the source of all knowledge and good within himself, that it represents the universal dimension of his own being, and that somewhere each individual in his search for truth finds it by finding himself, that he is himself the embodiment of an avatar, of a power for good locked within his own being. There is much in the general presentation of the material bearing up on the teacher to indicate that he is a mysterious and venerable being, a being in whose keeping lies the solution to many things, that the search for him and the attainment of him is of the primary importance to all concerned, that also from him forever pour certain instructions, certain master messages, that he is the center, that he is the desired of all nations, that he is the hope of all men. And by this time the Near East had had sufficient contact not to be completely absorbed in a totally nationalistic religion, so that this teacher of righteousness, though to the members of a sect might be only their teacher, was certainly understood by many as representing a universal messianic power of some kind. It is only therefore when to scholarship as we know it today is added a larger dimension of intuitive insight that we shall probably come nearer to the essential meaning of these scrolls discovered in the Dead Sea, or by the Dead Sea. Even the scrolls themselves become archetypal in our experience. They represent another discovery out of darkness, out of the earth, out of things hidden. They tell us something of potential, and always these are archetypal symbols of discoveries out of ourselves. For out of the past is out of the dark, submerged subconscious of our own existence. Psychologically, we all have locked within us something equivalent to the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have our own past. We have our own archetypal origin. We have a tremendous submerged content which we do not know how to draw upon. Accidents and incidents, circumstances and conditions bring part of this submerged heritage to the surface. It is then and then only that we discover it. And in discovering it, find ourselves bewildered, for we do not know how to orient this submerged part into the conscious function of our daily living. Thus the discoveries of archaeology, the discoveries of things and treasures buried in the earth, have always the meaning to us of a kind of personal experience. And it is perhaps for this reason that we become so fascinated, so interested. It is not especially important to the average man of today whether these scrolls were found or not. But the romance of archaeology, the drama of discovery, is of the tremendous practical value and attraction to all of us. Because some way we realize that locked within the past, locked within the darkness of some kind or dimension of earth, must be answers that we all need. They are locked within our own experience nature, within our own unexplored internal. These crypts and tombs and strange hiding places remind us that all life is concealed in death, and that every tomb is a womb of something, and that for most the womb is the tomb. That out of the search of man into these hidden things comes the archetypal motion of man to examine himself, to search within himself for the meaning of everything that happens around him. This was the mystic burden of the first century in the Near East. Men were beginning to speculate upon the tremendous significance of internals. And this speculation was forced upon them by the tribulation which externals were passing through. The individual no longer able to depend upon society turned to himself for strength and understanding. And today we are in much the same crisis. No longer able to depend upon society for our spiritual security, for our psychological integration. We are being challenged to explore ourselves and to restore our own natures. And out of all of this, whether we know it or not, or realizing it or not, man today is formulating the dim shadow of his teacher of righteousness, because he is already beginning to recognize that knowledge must lead somewhere, that knowledge must mean something, that innumerable fragments of discovered facts, now scattered about unrelated, must be brought together, and that out of all these things must come a knowing of how to live, that the great teacher must take knowledge and redeem it, passing it through his own consciousness and transforming it into enlightenment, transforming all wisdom into understanding, and understanding into illumination. We also recognize every day the shortcomings imposed by a materialistic and unbalanced form of education. The teacher of righteousness, therefore, stands out forever in our thinking, in a series of strange, peculiar, twisting motions. For example, we are now studying and trying to justify our researches in atomics and electronics. We are trying to justify. And we say to ourselves and each other, there is going to be great good come from these things. We're going to find cures for disease, cures for problems, new sources of energy for transportation and communication, new ways of taking care of more people in this world when other natural resources begin to fail. Somewhere good is going to come out of these things. And we begin to dream and hope and wonder when the human mind is going to dedicate itself to this good rather than to dedicate itself to destruction. By this very process, we are creating the archetypal pattern of the teacher of righteousness. Back in the 16th century, when Nostradamus the prophet was writing his strange and complicated quatrains, we remember that he claimed that the information which he possessed came from the temple originally at Jerusalem, and that belonging as he did to the descendants of the house of Issachar, he had been the one who had carried the records of the temple. That he bore with him certain ancient documents by means of which he made his prophecy. According to Nostradamus, at the end of the 20th century, what he terms a great priest-teacher will arise. Actually, the description given by Nostradamus coincides very closely with the teacher of righteousness of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This teacher is to come, is to be the one who brings soul or internal life to knowledge, that he is to again form the priestly kingdom, that he is to again unite man's spiritual and material life in one indissoluble bond of constructive union, that he is to come after the wars have passed, and that under him shall be established an order in which the world will dwell together in peace for a great length of time. This is again, this promise, this idea that there has always existed in the world truth, that it has been in the keeping of a few enlightened persons, that these enlightened persons, gathering around themselves such qualified ones as they could find, have become teachers and founders of faiths and philosophies, religions and doctrines, and that these teachers, though they may individually perish, belong to a mysterious, ever-flowing motion or hierarchy that does not perish, that the teacher of righteousness always lives, but that in enlightened ages he comes forth, and in benighted ages he remains in darkness. We are also reminded, of course, of the words of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, when virtue fails upon the earth, then I come forth. And this desire, or this archetypal instinct, that man in emergency releases solution, has been part of the doctrine of religion since the dawn of time. So we're beginning, as I say, to develop a series of orientations around the central concept of these scrolls and what they mean. Some of these orientations may be justified by facts. Others of them will be justified by intuitive realizations. Some of these justifications may be proven or demonstrated historically. Others can be known only psychically or psychologically as experiences within man. But we have still to make this tremendous transition of discovery, namely, what do these scrolls mean to us as individuals in our way of life? In what way can we justify archaeology in terms of growth? And in each instance, this progress, this contribution, lies in the thoughtfulness which it causes in us, and the resolutions which it strengthens, and the search for truth which it inspires, the tolerance and compassion which it engenders. These are the valuable things. And when the scrolls begin to exercise this influence, then they will be what all sacred writings and mystery writings have always been: guides and stimulants to man's own self-improvement. Until they achieve this condition, they are merely interesting books. But when man begins to find that he can use them, and by using them or meditating upon them, he is drawn into being a better person, then they accomplish a great work in his life. Well, time's up.